We have a new guest joining us for this podcast. Meg is a researcher and educator looking at ways that parents can have more effective conversations with their children around sexuality. And I really appreciated the insights that she shares from her own experiences as a parent and an educator, as well as what she's learning in her research on her Instagram, Shame Free Chastity. I really hope that you appreciate the things that she shares with us. And I hope that this will be the first of a couple different podcasts that we do together as far as how to help us as parents improve the dialogue that we're having with our children to really help give them the education and preparation they need to navigate their sexual development. If you're like me, you know your mind can be your best or your worst friend. Our mind is an amazing tool that can do incredible things, but our mind can also create problems out of nowhere. Sometimes our mind keeps recommending the same solutions to problems even when they aren't working. I see this pattern play out as individuals try to overcome their anxiety, depression, or even struggles with pornography, using approaches that make sense but aren't very helpful. This podcast will show you how real researchers and clinicians are changing the way we approach mental health and reveal helpful research-supported principles designed to help real people with real problems. My name is Dr. Cameron Staley, and welcome to the Life After Series Radio. Well, I'm so excited for this conversation. So Meg has been gracious in sharing her time and joining us today. And we were just chatting a little bit before, and I don't even know if we can contain all the things we want to cover in this conversation. So this might be a couple of chats. But Meg, I just want you to introduce yourself and kind of tell us how you got interested in how to help kids learn about sexuality and kind of some of the research that you've been involved in.
Okay, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I was born in Switzerland, but I've been raised in Utah since the time I was 1. So I'm definitely basically native to Utah. And I was raised in a very conservative religious home. I am LDS, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And all of the messaging I got about sex growing up was that sex can be good after you're married, but any sexuality before then is not just not okay, but it's like not good at all. In fact, we could call it evil. So I had all that messaging growing up, just like a lot of us from conservative backgrounds. Anyway, I graduated from the U of U, the University of Utah, in 2004 with an early childhood development degree. And the next year, I got an early childhood teaching certificate, and I got married in 2005. And then I taught first grade for 2 years. And then we had our first child, our oldest and our only son. And so I was a stay-at-home mom after that for 12 years to then 4 children total. And I realized as they were growing up that I was mostly just afraid of sex. I was having sex with a husband within the bonds of marriage, but I also didn't know how to talk about it with my kids. And my own fear for my childhood came along with me as I became a mother. And I remember one time when my oldest was maybe 5, he kept putting his hands down his pants. And all I had ever learned about, touching yourself, and I couldn't really even say the word masturbation at that point. I would I'd either call it the big M, whisper it, or I'd just be like, masturbation. I'd have to whisper this shameful word. And anyway, the only thing I knew about it was masturbation for sure leads to pornography use. Pornography use for sure leads to child pornography, which leads to child molestation, which leads to prison. So I see my 5-year-old innocent little boy with his hands down his pants, and I'm like, he's gonna end up a criminal, So anyway, but I didn't know how to talk about it. And so I remember saying to him, buddy, just don't do that, okay? Just take your hands out. I can't tell you why, but just trust me. God doesn't want you to touch down there. And I couldn't say the word penis, just so much fear. So I want people to know that I'm just the same. Hopefully you're not as fearful as I am, everybody listening, but I come from a big fearful background about sexuality. And then, but luckily we can change, right? So when my third daughter, and I've shared this on my Instagram where I share research about sexuality, but when my third daughter was about 3 years old and she was in the bath and she was like, I'm done, mommy, but I was sure she hadn't washed all her important parts yet. So I said, well, did you wash your private parts? Because we could say that word, private parts. That's not scary, you know? And she was like, yes, mommy. And I was like, pretty sure she hadn't. So I said, are you sure? Did you wash all your private parts? And she said, yes, mommy, I washed my back bum and my front bum. And in that moment, I realized as like a 38, 37-year-old woman that I didn't know the name to teach her for that anatomy. I knew that girls had vaginas. I knew that I had one, but I also knew that that was the internal anatomy. That doesn't account for all of the outside parts of a female, you know, genitalia. So I didn't know what to tell her. And I realized I have been so led by fear in everything about sexuality. And some of my favorite scriptures were even, you know, like be of good cheer and do not fear type. And Jesus always would say, fear not to his disciples in the New Testament. And yet all I was informed by around sexuality was fear. So it was at that point when I finally realized I need to not be afraid. And if that means I become some crazy sexual addict because I'm learning about sexual anatomy and sexuality in general, then I guess so be it. But also the glory of God is intelligence, right? And so I decided to, I think I Googled for the first time, and it was so scary because I was like, sure, I would come across pornography, but I found out that the front portion of female genitalia is called a vulva. And so now my girls will say, mommy, I washed my vulva and I washed my bum. And so we know they got all of their important private parts clean, as opposed to like, don't say the word because something's wrong with that word. So that's sort of what led me at least to being interested. Okay. And then so about that time, I decided like, I really want to research this or at least kind of find out more because I'd heard a lot of what I was hoping were myths at that point. Like, for example, if you talk to your kids about sex, then they will go have sex. Like I had heard that so often. And I really wanted to see if that was true. And my husband and I are both kind of research nerds. And I was like, maybe this is what I want to do. Anyway, so I applied down to the Family and Human Development program down at BYU. And I was accepted, and I work with Dr. Laura Padilla Walker, who is an adolescent parenting expert and has in the past 5 years started researching how parents talk to their kids about sex. So primarily what I've been able to research is how we parent about sexuality, which is great since I'm a parent of 4 children. But also kind of along the side of this all is this pornography dynamic, because that's one of the things I was the most scared of. As my, 5-year-old down his pants story would show you. So, but I remember talking to Dr. Walker, like, saying, I'm really interested in, pornography and how we talk about that. And she was like, everybody's talking about pornography. Let's do something different and talk about how to talk to kids about sex. So that's what we've been researching. But what I found, which is probably no surprise, is that it's very parallel and they're very related. And to parent well around pornography, we have to first parent well around sexuality.
Yeah. Well, I love it. I just love listening to you talk. It's Meg, you can just keep it going. It's so human. It's so relatable. And
I'm very human.
Yeah. And I like that image of your little 5-year-old. Yeah. And mine just goes to, he's going to be in prison.
Like he was for sure. Worst case scenario.
Yeah, that's just where it's going to go. And I think about all the messages you hear around sexuality and definitely around pornography are really, really scary. And
all of it.
Fear-based. And it's just going to lead to something worse and worse and the worst things imaginable. And it's terrifying. And I think about the role in my life that's the most difficult, that I worry about the most and probably try the most, is as a parent. And I'm like, I don't want to mess this up. Like, this is really important. Like, I care about my kids' future. I'd prefer they not end up in jail. I want to develop healthy sexuality, but oh no, here's a 5-year-old. This moment seems important. And I don't know what to do.
Right.
And we often are paralyzed where it's like, wait, okay, yeah, sex is good. I know that, but it feels really scary in this moment. Because often what we've been taught are really, really fear-based messages.
That's right. Yes, we're taught that. So sexuality is good, but up until you're married, it's not good. And so anything about sexuality is therefore not good. And if something is not good, like this is how our minds go, right? It's like if something is not good, that means it's probably evil. And if you had any kind of sexual experience, like putting your hands down your pants and you might have liked it, then that probably means you're evil too. And if I'm evil, then I have no hope and I may as well try to feel better, which means I'm probably going to put my hands down my pants again because that at least felt good when I'm
Yep.
feeling so miserable because of all these messages I'm telling myself.
Yep. And what you just described there is probably what I've heard from every adult I've worked with that struggles with pornography.
And they label it an addiction because
Yep.
it feels like a cycle. But really, the cycle was I feel bad and I want to feel better.
Yeah. That's pretty
And
much
that's
it.
their coping mechanism of choice, essentially.
It is. It's I feel bad and I want to feel better. And
Right.
sexual experiences feel better. It
Mhm.
allows me to escape this discomfort or pain or just feeling terrible about myself.
Yeah.
But then the thing I choose to escape or to feel better, I feel terrible about. And that
Right.
there is a cycle there, but it's
Right.
much more of an emotional cycle than a biological cycle that you might see with substances that we
Right.
might call an addiction.
That's right. And I would like to say here that, that is one coping mechanism that lots of people turn to.
Mm.
However, and that's not a coping mechanism I've turned to, but I in my life have turned to chocolate chip cookies. And we laugh about that and we say, oh, you're, getting the ice cream out and eating from the carton or Netflix binging or scrolling for hours on social media. But we don't judge those things the same way that we judge pornography as a coping mechanism. And so, you know, me eating a dozen cookies is not good for me, but I'm not telling myself like you're evil for doing that. I might tell myself, I can't believe you did that. That's awful. That was so many cookies. And that usually leads to me eating more cookies to feel better. So
Yep.
it's the same cycle. We just, for some reason, put pornography on this worst sin ever shelf. And it's just so judged and so shamed. And that's not to say that pornography is good for you, but 12 cookies isn't good for me either.
Yep.
So
And I love that comparison because I'm with you. That's probably my go-to is I go to sweets. I love my chocolate, love my ice cream, love my brownies. But there's no words attached to that like, well, that was sinful.
right.
Or, God's unhappy with you, or you are now unworthy, or this might end your marriage.
Right.
Those dozen cookies.
Right. Or you
And
can't
yet,
go to the, temple, an LDS temple if you've eaten a dozen cookies. But if you've eaten pornography, that's you're not good. You're not okay now.
Yep. And so I think that's the challenge there is anything in the sexual realm, we often grow up, well, we don't talk about it. And we're smart. Like you've kind of articulated the human mind where it's like, if we don't talk about it, we learn intuitively, well, it's shameful then.
Right.
It's bad. That's the only reason why we don't talk about things that are good and safe. We talk about.
Right.
If we don't talk about it, it must be shameful and bad.
There's something wrong with it.
There's something wrong.
Yeah. This is a silly example. I heard Nate Bagley talk about this one time. The whole idea of the word Voldemort in the Harry Potter series, like it was he who must not be named, because if you said it, it was like the scariest thing ever. And yet good old Harry, was like, I'm not afraid of saying his name. And he would just say it and everybody was so shocked. And yet nothing bad happened to him either. And it normalized it. So yeah, like we're so afraid of certain things and therefore don't talk about them, but it's the not talking about things that gives them the power of destruction, really. which might seem kind of extreme to say, but like we're often creating the very problems we're trying to avoid because of the way we talk about pornography or the way we don't talk about sexual health.
Wow, I wonder if you could say that again a little bit louder for those folks in the back, because I think that is it. That's it. And it's not more complicated than that. That's it. That we're often creating the problem because we're not talking about it.
Right. Like I have an Instagram account where I share the research I'm doing and also just that I'm gathering up, and it's called Shame Free Chastity. And I just posted today, the day that we're recording this, that we're creating the problems that we're trying to avoid. Like we are part of the problem when all we talk about is pornography, because for some reason it's really easier for parents to say pornography is bad, don't ever look at it, it's the worst thing ever. But we have a really hard time talking about wet dreams and female anatomy and sexual arousal and pleasure and those types of things, or masturbation. And so if we're not willing to talk about what is good and normal, and that's not to say those things, let me rephrase that. If we're not willing to talk about sexual development and our kids have no information, then when they want information, they're going to turn to something that will give them that information. And pornography is fake sexual activity. It's not real relationship almost ever. So we're creating the problem by never talking about it, or talking about it in such scary terms that then when they inevitably see it and they become sexually aroused, if they don't know that sexual arousal is normal, then but they know they shouldn't be feeling sexual arousal because maybe we've only ever talked in terms of what they shouldn't do or shouldn't feel, then they're inevitably going to feel bad. But then also at the same time that they're feeling bad emotionally, they're going to be like, but I feel really good in my body. So it's so confusing. Whereas if we've told kids, so part of you being a sexual being is you're going to feel sexually aroused sometimes. And one thing that I've told my kids is that when you're developing, especially in your teenagers, the most random things can bring you to feel sexually aroused. And there's a lot of research, well, a lot is probably not the right word. There is research that shows, especially girls can be females can be so sexually aroused by such a variety of things, including animals copulating, or, animals mating and having sex that way. And if they don't know that that's normal, it's just like a surefire recipe for our kids feeling really awful about themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I know as a researcher, we try to find different types of stimuli and some that were designed to just induce arousal or sexual arousal, and to try to find neutral stimuli for women was like nearly impossible. It's like, wait a minute, this is a picture of a plant. Like there should not be any arousal. What's going on? And I think, it's like, we're a lot more diverse and complex than we think we are. Right. But if we're unaware of that, or it's like, wow, I felt aroused noticing someone was attractive, or singing a hymn in church, or seeing a sexual image, and I've been taught my whole life that those things are really, really bad. Yeah, I must be really, really bad. When really it's like, no, we respond. Right. And I think about the challenge is we're so good at like teaching the thou shalt nots, I think is kind of what you're saying is, well, don't turn to porn. That's not going to be good. That's not real. That's not educational. So don't do that. But I think we struggle a lot more with the thou shalts, like the things you need to do and the things you need to learn, because that feels more uncomfortable. But I'm convinced, I've worked with so many adults with porn issues, and it's the same story. It's, we didn't talk about sexuality at home. Or maybe I had the sex talk once, and it was the most uncomfortable conversation ever, and we never talked about it again. Or the only message I heard was, sex is really scary, sex is bad, don't ever get involved in porn. Right. It was either absent or quite scary. And those are, for me, the ingredients that I've seen that contribute to a struggle with pornography kind of down the road. And what I hear you saying is, maybe we should talk more about sexual development and normalize this beautiful human experience. And if we did that, as our children are growing and developing and they experience sexual arousal, they'll understand it. Right. They won't need to hide it. And if they got questions, they might turn to us, which is my preference, than their buddies or the internet. I don't want those sources teaching my children. But if I'm not teaching them, that's where they're going to go. Kids are smart. Kids are curious.
They're going to learn it from somewhere. It just might not be you if you're not talking about it. Yeah. Exactly. So with what you were just saying there, do you want to?
No, you can jump in. I was going to say, what have you learned in your research about the role of parents in educating kids? What's helpful? What's less helpful?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go. Like what all of it you just said was exactly why I wanted to go to grad school, because I started hearing some different LDS sex therapists talking about what they see clinically and some research, but most of it was just anecdotal, like what they've observed. And so this is where I'm a little nerdy, and I was like, I want to see what the research really says. Like, if I'm going to talk to my kids about sex, I want to know for sure that it's going to lead to good things in their lives, because everything I've ever been taught is that we shouldn't do it and nobody can really talk about it comfortably. So there must be something really wrong about sex. Anyway, so just like kind of as an overview of what the research really shows is it's a myth that talking to kids about sex leads kids to having sex. And that's one of the biggest fears that parents across the board, not just religious parents, and not just conservative parents, but like the sample that I'm thinking of from this article was these are all American kids, but I'm pretty sure this would extrapolate outward as well to other international countries. But parents are uncomfortable talking to kids about sex in general. And therefore, most parents don't talk to their kids about sex in general. And parents worry that if they talk about sex, their kids are going to go have it. It's as if like you've given them all this information, kind of like, well, we taught them how to drive a car, so now they're going to go drive. But that's not true. And one researcher called it the green light syndrome, that parents are so worried that talking to kids about sex is like you're giving them a green light. And that was my biggest fear too. If I talk to them, then won't they go do it? But no, in fact, I love that the research shows the complete opposite. It's the parents who don't talk to their kids about sex, who have kids who are sexually active at earlier ages, whereas the kids who have parents who talk to them, which again, they're few and far between, but they exist. So as the research has been able to measure that, those kids put off having sex. The research term is like they've delayed their sexual debut. They don't have sex as early. So if we, have these chastity values of we believe our kids shouldn't have sex till they're married, but we're never talking to them about sex. I mean, it gets down to so simple as a thing of somebody might be having sex and not even know it because they don't know what sex is because they've never learned what it is. And so, and oral sex, is that sex? It's just as much sex as penis and vagina sex. And I should say, we're going to say the real terms here on this conversation. So sorry if that makes anybody uncomfortable. Anyway, it's just such basic knowledge that kids don't have. And so then sometimes they're completely uninformed about the choices they are or aren't making, Yeah. So.
And if you take a moment and step back and think about if we care so much about sexuality, that it's such an important part of our existence. And I would say in our kind of faith background, because we're both Latter-day Saints, it's a sacred part of our experience,
right,
to never talk about it or prepare our children for it. It's like, is that really honoring something that is quite sacred and important?
Right.
And just be like, wow, this is so important, good luck with it.
It's Hope that goes well for you.
Yeah. And I think about like, I don't do that with my children's physical health. Like we're in sports, we're exercising, we eat nutritious food. I don't do that with our mental health. We talk about emotions a lot. My kids are like, Dad, seriously, do I have to tell you about how this event impacted me or the feelings I have before I go up to bat playing baseball? It's like, well, yeah, we got to talk about the nerves and normalize it because that's what we're doing. But then when it comes to sexuality, it's like, oh, we shouldn't talk about that one though.
Something wrong with that one.
Yeah, but it's like, the more important something is, probably the more conversation we should have about it. And yet there's an inverse relationship around sexuality in that regard.
Right. And my opinion is, and this is what the research shows again, is that the reason there's this inverse relationship is because everybody's so afraid of it. Everybody thinks it's just like the scariest thing ever. And so therefore, if we talk about it, not only will my kids have sex, but, again, they'll probably end up in prison. Like we're just so afraid. And it's everything, at least for me, especially, and this is what I've seen so often when I hear people's stories, is that the fear was the driving motivator in how they handled sexuality, which usually means they didn't handle it, except to say, don't have anything to do with it. The problem being their kids are still sexually developing all along the way. They just don't have, the supportive parents to help them through that development.
Yeah, let's talk about that piece. So, like in our faith background, there's a lot of focus on, sexuality is important and it's sacred. Something that we would encourage people to wait till they're married in a committed relationship, which I agree with. I think about sexuality is often best in a committed adult relationship. That was something that I valued and my partner valued. And those are values I want to instill in my children. So I think that's a pretty good way to kind of grow up. And yet our children, as soon as they hit puberty, are going to experience sexual arousal and sexual desire and have fantasies and urges and wet dreams and may touch themselves, even though we may value like, oh, wait to have sex until you're married. That sexual development doesn't occur or begin when you're married. There's years of preparation. And I've wondered about that period where, looking back at my own life, it's like, yeah, hormones were pretty intense around that time. And it's like, what is the purpose of that? If we're these adolescents with a frontal lobe that's not fully developed and we have a hard time regulating impulses, we got all this sexual desire and we're not supposed to do anything with it. Either that's unfair or I haven't really understood the divine purpose of that. And think about, if sexuality is that important, maybe there's a preparatory period of time where we need to learn about it. And there might be some opportunity to learn a little bit, have some conversations, develop a framework before you're an adult where consequences for sexual activity are much greater.
Right.
And I think about in this parenting moment, we're like, oh, we don't want to mess it up. And so I guess I want parents to hear that this is scary. And yet I think with education and direction, it doesn't have to be. That these can be quite meaningful, loving conversations that are based on research and some of the data that you're sharing.
Right.
And they're educational and really developmental to help our children through this really crucial period of their life.
Right. Well, exactly. All that you said, yes. One of the major questions I'm asked about often, especially through my research Instagram account, the Shame-Free Chastity, is like, what's developmentally appropriate? And I have this background in early childhood development, and we always talked about, developmentally appropriate practice. Like we wouldn't give, we'll use Harry Potter as the example, since I've already mentioned it. I wouldn't give a Harry Potter book to an early reader, even if they can read, even if they are a legitimately early reader. That's too much. It's too big. It's not developmentally appropriate. But for some reason, and I was the exact same way, when you think about, well, how do I handle sexual development in a developmentally appropriate way? It just feels so big and overwhelming. And probably because, unlike reading that we all learn, hopefully, or at least usually have the opportunity to learn in a developmentally appropriate way, most of us don't have a developmentally appropriate background in our own sexual development. So it's really hard for us to teach our own children in any kind of developmentally appropriate way. But you think about other development, like we talked about earlier before we started recording, a child learning to walk, when they inevitably fall down, because they will. My kids have some gross motor delays, and so they walk later than most kids, all four of them. And so they fall down a lot, but actually when they fall down, we cheer them on because it means they were up in the first place. It's so exciting. And like, you stood up, of course you fell down, because that's part of it. That's part of the learning, but you did it. You stood up for a minute, and then they take their first step, and it's so exciting. And of course they're going to fall down. And we would never say to our child, like, get up, we don't fall down, like, that's bad. You're wrong to fall down. That doesn't even make sense. And so, and like riding a bike, we teach our kids, most of us, maybe some of us, my kids, again, these gross motor delays, I can't send my kids out on a bike and just say, go learn how to do a bike. We kind of like help them. We usually start with training wheels or like a balance bike. And then eventually, we're holding onto the back of them, and then we let them go. But they're going to fall down, and all of our kids have, and it's just part of it. The tricky part with sexual development is that there's not really a great way to practice sexual development like there is for biking or walking, because what we're telling our kids is, don't have sex. And maybe that's the distinction we can make. Having sex is one part of sexuality, but it's certainly not all of it. And our kids are born just like we are. We're all sexual beings from the start. There's evidence, well, not just evidence, there's like films that children in utero, babies in utero, touch themselves in their genitals, repeatedly, because on some level it probably is feeling good. And from a religious perspective, we believe that God made our bodies this way. It's not an accident that our bodies can experience that kind of pleasure. And yet we don't want to tell our kids, like, it feels so scary to say, one day you'll have sex. So to develop to that point, go practice. Of course, we're not going to say that. So one of the things that's interesting to think about is, well, what comes up until the actual act of having sex?
Yep.
There's so much emotion development. There's so much physical development. And when we talk to our kids about sex, maybe that is the way that we help them practice, because what that's doing is normalizing everything. So they're not afraid of their own bodies and the changes that they're going through, where, as opposed to sending them out into the world and saying, go practice sex so one day you can have a wholesome sexual relationship within the bounds of marriage. So perhaps it's the conversations we have with our kids that are major portions of the way that they are, if practicing is the right word for that development, like that they're practicing being sexual beings because they're conversing with us and they're learning about it and they're understanding that all of it's normal. For example, I use the idea of sexual arousal because it's what made me the most uncomfortable when I was growing up and when I became a mom. And a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about it. But like, if you talk about sexual arousal, can I share a couple examples actually of this? I've shared this on my Instagram too, but so sorry if this is a repeat, but my daughter, my youngest, just in the past year, sometime during the pandemic, she was in the bath and she was repeatedly pouring water onto her vulva area. And when I came in the bathroom, she said, "Mommy, when I pour water on my vulva, it feels good." And in that moment, it's like I could see myself, and how the old Meg would have handled this would have been like, "Don't touch that," just like with my son. You shouldn't be doing that. I can't tell you why, but just like, put that cup down. God doesn't want you to feel that goodness right there, Anyway, but what I did instead was I took a deep breath, because I still have those feelings in me. And I kind of remember like, oh, remember, the research doesn't back up any of your fears here. And I said to her, yeah, it does. It does feel good. That's how God made our bodies. And then I wanted to kind of deflect the attention away from her vulva, kind of just to see what would happen in that circumstance. Like if she would be so obsessed with it, like we're so worried kids will get so compulsive about sexuality if we're ever talking about it. And I was like, where else on your body feels good to pour water? And I got some water and I poured it on her shoulder. Like, does it feel good on your shoulder? And, does it feel good on your elbow? How about your knee? And then this part, I'm pretty sure she circled back, and this has happened a few times. So I think on this one instance, she came back and she was like, but it feels the best when I pour it on my vulva, and I was like, okay, yeah, it does. God made our bodies to feel good down there. And then we moved on and it didn't come up. And then, so that was like to a 5-year-old.
Yep.
And then with our son, our oldest son, he's 14 now, but when he was 13, my husband and I, we've been practicing just like I'm researching to talk about sex, but until you've done it, it can still feel kind of scary, because just saying those words for the first time with kids can be really uncomfortable for almost everybody. But once you do it, you do get more comfortable, which is the good news. Anyway, the one thing that we hadn't ever really said was like that the penis actually goes into the vagina when, married couples or any couples are having that type of sex. We hadn't really ever said that. So he asked about that and it came up, and we kind of took a deep breath. We looked at each other and we said, well, the penis, has to be erect and then it goes into the vagina. And then he said, well, wouldn't that hurt?
Wow.
And I looked at my husband, because I was like, oh my gosh, what do we say here in my head, thinking all this? And like, do we say it feels good? Because if he knows it feels good, then won't he go do it? But we know better, again, because of the research. So I looked at my husband, he looked at me, and he goes, nope, it feels really good.
Yep.
And it was that simple. And my son moved on from it. He wasn't like, what? It feels good. I need to go do it, And because just like everything, we just talk normally, they move on, because sex is not the only thing on their minds, unless of course, maybe we're not talking about it and they have all these questions and don't have a source of information.
Yep. Well, that's wonderful. I think you highlighted that our kids are just naturally curious.
Yes.
And that curiosity is so important. That's how we learn. That's how we explore. That's how we determine cause and effect. Like, we would never punish that in a school setting.
Never.
We would
praise it, actually.
We would praise it. Oh, you're learning and you're curious.
You're so curious.
You experimented. And I love that you've got that education background. Because like, that's the skill set. But then it's like when it comes to sexuality, it's like, doesn't apply. It's like, no, it actually does.
Right.
But I think what I appreciate is you highlighted, I still got those fears as a parent. Even as I'm researching,
yes,
and I know the data and I see a better way, there's still a human element. I still have how I was brought up.
It's still in there.
It's still in there. But also as an adult, I've got capacity for all of that. I can recognize that this feels scary, this feels wrong. I still hear those old messages, my kid's going to prison. And it's like, oh, wait, but none of that is actually accurate. How do I want to respond in this moment? And when we drop in with the actual education, like, yeah, it does feel good. It's not going to hurt. Our kids, honestly, they just move on.
Right.
And that's been
they don't become obsessed with it if they just know the truth.
That's been my experience is I ruminate about how do I have this conversation? What are the words I need to say? I don't want to mess this up.
Right. We're stressing.
We're stressing. And I bring it up and then my kids are like, cool, Dad. Can we change the topic? I'm just bored. Yeah. They're like, they might be interested. Like, okay, you answered my question. We don't need to keep talking about it. Like, what's for lunch? Yeah. Like,
right.
They're just ready to move on. It's just part of a conversation. And maybe I hadn't thought about this, but like you said, we need to teach our kids in a developmentally appropriate way. Maybe we need to look at ourselves as where do we need to start developmentally?
Yeah.
And
that's a really good point. Because a lot of us, like I said, don't have that background. So we're kind of, maybe we're toddlers in sexual development, and that's okay. Because development is literally developmental.
Yep, I think you're right.
It grows and changes.
So if we're toddlers, then we start with words.
Yes.
It's like, okay, that's what we teach our 2 and 3-year-olds.
Right.
Like, let's name things. Like, here's your elbow, here's your nose, here's your penis. Let's practice using our words. And for adults, that might be where we need to start educating our kids. Right. And it's like, okay, now where can we go next? Let's learn about arousal. Oh, that's really uncomfortable. It's like, okay, let's learn about that one next. And because I think as you highlighted your children's experiences, I just had these memories of my own. And I'm like, I'd rather talk about my kids' experiences. But like I could think about as a teenager, even sitting in church and like enjoying the talks and the environment and experiencing an erection. And in my mind, I hadn't thought about this in a long time. That was a really shameful experience where it's like, I'm in church to feel the Spirit and to worship and to be instructed. I should not be having an erection in this moment.
Right.
But as a 16, 17-year-old, sometimes that happens. And looking back, I didn't have an understanding of that other than this is so embarrassing.
Right.
And I can't believe this is happening in church. What is wrong with me? That's probably the only framework that I had. And then it's like, okay, I'm never going to talk about this.
Never.
I'm never going
to. It might mean you're the worst person ever. Like it just might mean that. So don't ever talk about it.
I'm not going to joke with my buddies about this. No. I'm not going to talk to my parents. I'm not going to talk to my church leaders. I'm not going to bring this up in prayer. I'm not going to go to any source that could potentially help me. I'm just going to just hope that this goes away sometime soon. And it's like, oh, that's really unfortunate because that's a probably pretty common experience that no one's talking about.
Exactly. And funny that you mentioned that experience. I just like 2 weeks ago with my 14-year-old, I can't remember how it came up, but we were talking about like random erections. And this is where I have to say, I would not have been comfortable talking about this even a couple of years ago. But again, the more you do this, you get better at it. So now I can kind of take just a quick deep breath and say, hey, so I can't remember how it came up, but anyway, we were talking about erections in our kitchen and all of our little girls, I should point that out, our family's right there. So it's not like, we're like, if you want to talk about erections, go in another room, because erections are just part of a human experience. So my little girls also know that boys have penises that get erected. They don't really understand what that means necessarily. And we don't have to tell them because they're not asking and they're little, but they know the word.
Yep.
And anyway, so we're talking to my 14-year-old son about erections and how they sometimes just happen. And I first mentioned it. I think he mentioned erections. And then I was like, yeah. And like, you can just get erections so randomly, right? And he goes, because I said that, I think it gave him permission to be like, yes. And I just all of a sudden I'll just get them. And I wasn't even thinking about anything. I'm like, I know, like you could be walking by a tree and get an erection. And it's not like, you're not like that tree is so sexually arousing, but you just get an erection and we're just normalizing it. And so I wrote this course that I'm going to try to like put out into the world in the next year or so. One story I share in there that I want to share now, if that's okay. When I was like 12 or 13, I was up visiting my uncle's family farm in Idaho, and they had horses there. And I liked horses and was going over to see them and feeding them or whatever. And I noticed one horse was obviously male. And I noticed that this male horse's penis was very erected. I didn't know the word of erected at the time, but that's what it was. But I knew that it was something sexual, and my body responded. Wow. And I had all of this like sexual arousal feeling. And it was like this very polarizing experience where on the one hand I was like, whoa, this, like, I just remember, it was sexual arousal. So therefore it felt good. And at the same time, I was like, what kind of, demon am I to be I know I'm not supposed to feel sexual arousal. That's the one message I definitely know and heard at church. And that, that's it. I know I'm not supposed to be feeling this, but I'm not even feeling it about like humans. I'm feeling it about a horse. I must be some perverted. I just had so many shameful, horrible thoughts. And similar to what you mentioned about the, erection at church, I was like, I can never talk about this to anybody. They might, I am obviously some devil woman. And I just felt so horrible. And I had never spoken about that out loud ever until I think 3 years ago. I heard Jennifer Finlayson-Fife being interviewed about some research, kind of like I mentioned earlier, that females specifically are, they might not report sexual desire, as in they don't want to be sexual with the thing, but something can be very arousing to females. So many different things, including monkeys copulating, she said. And at that point, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm normal. And that was another real big catalyst into me wanting to research this. And I told my husband finally, I'm like, Phil, I've never even told you about this horse experience, but I thought I was like broken and evil and just everything bad. And I internalized that, and I was going to prove to God that I would keep the law of chastity despite being sexually aroused by horses, and I was like, oh my gosh, if I had only known that all that means is my body's working exactly how God intended it to. And sometimes horses, sometimes trees, sometimes, everything turns these raging hormones on as teenagers. But if they don't know that's normal, and they've been taught that you shouldn't have sexual feelings ever, then it's just like this recipe for disaster, and so much shame and so much secrecy and hiding and doubting themselves, which those emotional problems will lead to coping mechanisms. Segue into the porn discussion,
Yeah, that's it. And I appreciate you sharing that, where like just learning that education, just open that door, just completely transform that. It's like, oh, wow, I'm not some deviant. This is normal. And that just brings me back, because I have that same research nerd gene in me.
Yeah.
Where I started in this whole like, hey, is porn an addiction? Like, that's just an empirical question. What does the research say? That's all it was. And as I've looked at, especially women, like you said, are just way more complex.
Which, who knew? I bet a lot of your listeners don't know that. That's so important to know, Anyway, go on.
Men, maybe not as complex as far as what is arousing. And you show women images regardless of their sexual orientation.
Yes.
And it could be heterosexual sexual activity, homosexual, it could be primates. It doesn't matter. Women tend to respond. They become aroused.
And it doesn't mean they want that thing. It's just that their body is physiologically responding.
Yep, that's just how it works. And I think about one of the things that's, it's the most heartbreaking thing for me. As a psychologist, I work with a lot of sexual trauma and a lot of abuse and sexual assaults.
Right.
And I just wait for it to come up. And I let people share this when they're ready, but often at some point they say, when have shared a lot of their story and feel pretty safe with me, there's a moment where it's like, the part that I feel the worst about is, parts of it was pleasurable.
Right.
Or I might have experienced an orgasm. And it's like, how could that be? This was not consensual. This is not what I wanted. This was an assault. And it's like, yeah, this is how bodies work. You know, they still respond. This does not mean that you wanted this at all, but there's just shame attached to that because we don't understand how much our bodies are responding, even when it's inconsistent with our values and what we really want in that moment. And that's heartbreaking to me that this traumatic event occurred, and there's another level of shame based on how my body responded to that event.
And sexual arousal feels good, and therefore if it happened in the context of something that wasn't good, it can be so confusing.
So confusing. So your Instagram, I'm glad you referenced that a couple times. I've read so many of those posts. They're wonderful. And you had one just the other day where, I don't know, you just have a way of saying things where it's like, how have I never heard this before?
Oh,
and it was this idea that if we are not understanding sexual arousal and all we hear is porn is bad, anybody that's going to see sexual imagery, you're going to be aroused.
They're going to be aroused. It's literally made to be arousing.
That is the purpose of sexual imagery.
That is the purpose.
Is it's going to evoke that arousal.
Right.
And if you're not aware of that, you're going to be like, this is the thing I was taught my whole life is the worst thing ever.
Worst thing.
And I got aroused by it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, yeah, our kids should be aware that that's going to be normal.
Right.
That is what's going to happen. Just like when there's a piece of chocolate cake and you take a bite, it's going to be delicious. And
that's right.
You're programmed to respond to it like that.
Right. One of the articles I have linked to in my Instagram account, I've just been like pounding the porn lately. Oh, that doesn't sound good. Let me rephrase that. I have been really addressing. I might need to talk to you afterwards, Dr. Staley. Just kidding. I have really been addressing the pornography issue lately, and I think it's because like so many people are so just like searching and desperate for tools, which is why I'm also sending them your way, because your tools are so good and not addiction based, which therefore means they're way more effective. Yeah. That's also research based. Little plug for that, right? Anyway, I linked in there to an article called his name is Paul. I think his last name is pronounced Milan, but I might be saying that wrong. Malan. But it's called The Naked People on Your iPad or in your iPad. Anyway. And it's so good, and I recommend it to all parents because it first talks about bacon, and this could apply to anything baking, like cookies or bread or whatever. But we smell bacon, and without even tasting it, we have a physiological response. Like if we like bacon, of course, I like bacon, and when I smell bacon cooking, my mouth starts watering. I'm sure there's other things happening in my body too, where I'm like, I want this, and I do have desire for it, and it's just natural. And if I can't have the bacon, if it's somebody else's bacon, or like when you're, walking outside and you smell somebody else's grill going, that smell that you're not even going to get that meat because it's somebody else's, but we have this physiological response that's just built into our bodies. And yet I'm, when I smell that smell and my body responds, and let's say I don't eat the bacon, I'm not having some like coming off of an addiction fit.
Right.
I'm just like, oh, my body just responded to bacon. And that's normal. And that's what's supposed to happen. That's what bodies do. And nobody's surprised by a bacon response. But if we've always, like you just said, like if we've always been taught that porn's bad and we haven't been taught that sexual arousal is normal, then when we get sexually aroused, when we see pornography, and we're going to just think something's wrong with us. And oftentimes, if you feel like you felt good physically, but you also feel bad, emotionally, then some kids, if they feel safe, would maybe come and tell their parents about that. And then you could have like the reactive conversation. If you've never had it about sexual arousal, hopefully you have those skills to say, yep, that's normal. I wouldn't have, though, to be honest, had I not dived into this research. But if you don't have that warm relationship with your kids, then a lot of kids do will just go underground with it and not say anything. Just like we talked about with my horse story, like I'm not going to say to anybody that I was aroused by pornography. That means I'm the worst, because that's the thing we hear about all the time. Yeah. Anyway, and it just creates a cycle of now I feel bad, but I did feel good when I looked at pornography. Maybe if I want to feel good, that's the only way I can feel good now. Because I'm such a bad person. So I may as well go look at it. I've literally heard people say that have been trapped in what they considered a pornography addiction. It was kind of like, well, I knew I was going to hell anyway, so I may as well kind of enjoy the ride, because if I like this stuff, which I do because my body responds in this pleasurable way, then I must be evil. So what can I do?
Wow.
And it's just so it's like we're removing our agency from us when we think that that's the only option, and it's not.
Wow. And that's so painful to hear that, where people kind of demonize themselves for something that is so natural and I would say divine, but without that education, that's a really common place. And I think you are able to articulate that mind really well. And sometimes we're not that aware of it. We're not hearing those words, but that is the process. It's like, I'm not feeling good. This thing helps me feel better. Therefore, I just am a horrible person.
Right. Because I know this is bad.
Because it's bad. And then that continues. And so I mostly work with adults that struggle with compulsive sexual behaviors a little bit later on in life. But it starts there, where it's like, as an adolescent, I'm not able to navigate that complexity.
No.
That I hear this message where this is bad, but this also feels really good. What do we do with that? Do we internalize it? Where it's like, I must be bad. And so when I'm working with folks later on with sexual concerns, it's typically a shame-based reason why they're continuing to view. And it still has sexual desire and arousal as part of it. But typically, these really powerful emotions are preceding an urge to view pornography. And so I don't do as much work around sexuality as I do around emotional awareness. And what are other ways to respond to emotions and cope? And let's kind of maybe heal from these injuries that we've had from these messages and develop a healthier relationship with ourselves and with our body and sexuality. And it really is targeting that part, that this has become an emotional concern for you. And it's impacted people's relationships, their identity, their faith, like you mentioned, where it's like, like my religion is now painful because I don't feel like I fit anymore. And it really, so much of this I feel like could be resolved with your work. That, as parents, if we prepare our children and have these conversations around sexuality does not need to become compulsive. It doesn't. Pornography is not just
part of our life.
It's just part of our life.
Yeah.
And pornography is not this inevitable problem that people experience.
No.
I don't think that is the case. But it does require us as parents of children to, like, we got to get more comfortable. We got to go through our own development. We got to get educated. And it's not enough for us to know. Now we need to have these conversations with our kids. And my hope is, as we do this, and I think it's happening, that I would love to, I really enjoy my job. I love working with mental health. I don't love addressing porn issues. I would love that to go away. And I don't think that's unrealistic. I think we could eliminate compulsive porn viewing with better sexual development. So I hope people take that charge and say, at some point, I wish no one ever comes to me and says, I got a problem with porn. I hope that disappears. And I think we can do that through education.
Yeah. Right. Well, and hearing you talk, I'm thinking about, like, the way that I now talk to my kids about all of this. And trust me, I didn't before. We talk about, like, so yeah, when, if you were to come across a picture of naked people on the internet, or, people that are naked having sex, then you're going to feel sexually aroused by that, because that's how bodies are made. Then you get to think, wait, do I want to be looking at this material? Is this the kind of this is how I want to spend my time? And when you talk like that with your kids, there was never any shame involved at all. I never told them, if you see pornography that's naked people having sex on the internet, and if you like it, then you're the worst. That was never part of the conversation. So, and it just takes away all of this power that we've given pornography to ruin lives. Yeah. And the best part about it, and this is where I'm nerdy, is I love when the data actually back up what I've hoped for. And one of the undergraduates in my research group down at BYU just ran numbers on this data that we've been collecting, that we hadn't looked at this portion yet. And she asked the question, like, basically she was saying if parents are talking to their kids about sex in controlling ways or not talking about sex with their kids, are their kids, are they more likely to either turn to their friends or to pornography and other sexualized media? And it was a very significant finding of, yes, they turn to pornography when their parents don't talk to them. And that's one little bit of data I haven't seen in research yet. It's a pretty novel finding. And I think it's so important for parents to know that. And the research that already existed was that what children report across the board, like the majority of kids say that they want to learn about sex from their parents, but because most parents don't talk to their kids about sex, those same kids turn to their friends or to the media or other sources of information to get their sexual health information. So then taking that information and taking the fact that the kids who aren't getting talked to are the ones looking at pornography, it's like we can fix so much of this simply by having conversations about sex that aren't shame-based, like we really create the problems we're trying to avoid. And all the research backs that up. And I think that's really powerful because then it means we have power to change the circumstance.
I love that message. And that should be our kind of concluding point is we can do something about this.
Yes.
And it is having those conversations. And I think our children are willing. I mean, they're built to be curious and to learn. And it's us that kind of interferes with that process. And why I think that's so detrimental for us not to step up is as we don't prepare our children, they internalize that they are the problem.
Right.
And it's like, a lot of this comes from, we haven't, as adults, we didn't get this education, growing up.
Most of us
so it makes sense that this is hard. This is uncomfortable. But once you learn more, we got to do more.
Yep.
Once you learn something that's better, we got to do better.
That's
I think we can step up and we can actually help our children. So instead of like, how did you get involved in this porn? How could you do this? And blaming. It's actually taking some responsibility that, wow, maybe my own discomfort and lack of conversation, or maybe that I was a little bit too controlling around this. Maybe this contributed, and taking some ownership can really change this trajectory.
Yeah. And that's not to say, if a parent's listening to this and feeling their own shame right now because they're like, oh no, that is how I responded. I did freak out, just like I freaked out at my son when he was 5. Like it wasn't pretty. It was not good. It was like, it was so shocking. And anyway, like if you've had that experience, like good old Kristen Hodson has said this, just don't underestimate the power of repair either. Go back and say, hey, I totally overreacted. And I realized I haven't really taught you about some sexual health principles that'll really bless your life. Like, did you know that you feeling aroused by pornography is totally normal? And say, I'm sorry that I freaked out. I didn't know that wasn't a good response. And that's so powerful, and it brings connection. And really it's connection that is the most powerful part of all in all of this. Can I just say like one little research thing that's kind of random, but it totally applies. What the research shows about talking to kids about sex in general is it's a really good thing as long as you're open and warm. You're not like lecturing, controlling style. You're like, here's what it is, and here's our values, and here's what we hope for you, and all of this is normal. Like, so that's all good, and that's the good way to talk about sex with your kids. But even if you don't do that really great, the kids who have really positive sexual outcomes are kids who are really connected to their families and to their parents. So if you've got both going on, if you know how to connect with your child and have a good relationship and you're talking about sex, it's kind of like this synergistic awesomeness that like your kids are going to do well. But if you're still nervous about talking about sex, as long as you at least have a good relationship with your child, then that's huge. But if you can do both, it's just so powerful in its effect.
That's it. That's it. Is that relationship is so key, and that safety and that comfort that we can talk about anything,
right?
And not going to ridicule you or shame you for it,
right?
That is so protective, and I love that message of hope that we don't have to be flawless at this. And so when I'm working with couples,
and we won't be.
Yeah, you're gonna make mistakes.
We just won't be.
We're all learning about this, and I think about that as a parent. It's like, how long have I been a parent? 12 years. I'm only a 12-year-old parent. My oldest is 12. This is brand new. And every day she gets a day older. I've never done that kind of parenting yet. It's brand new for me. And then when I think I got that figured out, oh, my next kid's completely different.
Yeah.
And then my next one's different. Oh, my last one is so different. But
Mm-hmm.
parenting is new. I'm a 12-year-old parent. I am not even a teenager parent yet.
There you go.
There's a lot of learning to do. And as I work with couples, I do share that same thing that you shared. It's not about having conflict or making mistakes. It's how we repair them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's how we come back and be like, oh, I recognize I didn't handle that well. I care about you. I had to do some research. Let's talk about this again. This is how I responded, but this is how I would like to respond.
Right.
But those repair attempts predict the success of your relationships.
That's right.
It's not how well can we avoid any problems. That doesn't predict success.
No.
It's the repair.
And I thought that's what parenting would be from all my young women lessons. Like, once you're married and once you have kids, life is bliss and life is wonderful and it's all good and never have conflict, never get angry and all that. But that's not real life. And that's been a kind of a disappointment to me. Speaking of negative emotions, like, oh, darn, I thought it would be easy if I was just really, dedicated and learning a lot, but it's just not. But it's the connection that comes in repairing and fixing and apologizing and being humble and saying like, yeah, I didn't handle that well and I can do better and let's figure this out. That's what it's about.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And so I want people to hear that, like, even coming from a psychologist and an educator, I mean, you're doing this research. We still have these moments where it's like, oops.
Totally.
And I remember my kids watching a music video. This is maybe a year or so ago. And just the cover image was the singer unclothed, laying on a cloud or something. I can't remember. And I remember my wife, she's like, oh, turn that off real quick. And I'm like, wait, what happened? She's like, she was naked. And I'm like, let's actually turn that back on. Like, our first reaction was, oh my gosh, shut that down. Get ready for school. We got to go. And instead it's like, well, let's regroup here. Let's turn that back on and have a conversation.
There you go.
This adult woman is not clothed. What do y'all think about that? Is this something that we should be looking at as we're eating our breakfast on the way to school? Maybe not, doesn't make a lot of sense, but as we look at her, she's an attractive female. Like, aesthetically, she's an attractive woman. It's pretty normal to be curious about bodies and to find them attractive.
Yes.
And she's also a successful business person. Taking your clothes off probably sells more music. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And it's like, finding curiousness or looking at this image and be like, I'm looking at this more than other pictures.
Right.
Is normal.
Right.
And then we shut it off and we go to school.
Right.
And it's like, we can hit rewind and actually have a chat and
right.
normalize it, even in those moments. It isn't like, oh my goodness, they saw her bare bum. I've ruined my kids. It's like,
right.
It's all about how can we turn this into a learning opportunity?
Right. And to be clear, because I know I maybe even 5 years ago, had I heard you say that, I may have thought to myself, so is he saying that it's just okay for kids to look at naked women? And that's not it at all. The key there is that you're willing to have a conversation about it, because if you're not, and you're only ever saying, don't look at that, shut that off, don't look at that magazine, don't look at that show. It's not that we're saying, no, you should look at them. It's saying, let's have a conversation about it once it comes up, to be able to say, like, why do you think somebody would want to put themselves naked on a cloud? And just like you said, we've had these conversations too, like, sex sells. Sometimes people pretend they're like kissing a hamburger to sell the hamburger, and it's really effective marketing. And we're talking about those types of things, as opposed to like, oh, that's so awful, turn it off, which just shuts them down. But then they're also like, but I kind of liked it. Again, it's just the same thing. So it's not that we're advocating for you should let your kids watch naked women on clouds. It's that when those come up, because it will, whatever the form of the nakedness is that, your children or you come across, take a deep breath and ask, what's going on? Why is this here? Why would they think this is important to do? Or, like, what's actually happening? So your kids know that you can handle the conversation as well.
Yep. That's perfect. And I appreciate that, because sometimes I get that feedback where it's like, well, you're not like getting really, really upset about porn. It's like, I know that's the message that's out there.
Are you encouraging pornography use, Dr. Staley?
And it's like, yeah, I get that message and I get that fear, but that's an old script.
Totally.
It's time to move on from that. And And for me, pornography, the other term for it is adult entertainment.
Yes.
It is not designed for children.
No.
Children should not be watching this. And if we're not having these conversations, they often turn to it.
That's right.
But I do not want my children learning about relationships or sexual activity or bodies from adult entertainment. Pornography should not be that source. So I don't choose that source of entertainment for myself. I don't advocate that for my children. But we live in a world where we're going to see sexual imagery.
Right.
Like you said, it's selling our hamburgers. It's everywhere. Right. And so how can we...
Sex sells, and we know that. So it's going to be
have
everywhere.
These conversations, normalize our reactions, help our children through these moments. And for me, that is a source of adult entertainment that I don't choose to view. I'd rather watch sports or movies. Mm-hmm. And for our kids, it's not going to be helpful for them. Right. But if they come across it, having those conversations is going to be quite helpful for them.
Right. And just this kind of like to really nail in this idea that in the same way that you just said you like to watch sports, if every time a sports show came on and your kids were there and you're like, oh my gosh, turn that off, that's the worst, then they would probably develop a really large curiosity about what the heck is sports about. And so you can see that we can create our problems that we're trying to avoid simply by the way we're talking about it, as opposed to, oh, well, I'm not going to choose to watch this, but let's talk about why.
Yep. That's it. That's the key.
Don't create our own problems, basically.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, Meg, this was so much fun. I think we're going to have to do this again.
That'd be really great.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your stories, your personal examples, what you're finding in the research. I find your work so inspiring, where I recognize like I got a lot of growth. There's got a lot of things I got to learn. I got to get more comfortable. I need to have more conversations. And your work not only gives me the education that I need, but also the inspiration to do better. And I think you're modeling so much of that. So please check out your Instagram. It's just wonderful. I love it.
Thank you. And I try not to just speak from like, this is what I think. I try to really, really hard to find data that backs it up and then give examples. So I'm not perfect either. I stumble along and yesterday my little daughter talking to her grandma about how babies are made that randomly came up. Then she was like, Mommy, and what's that thing that you have inside of you that keeps you from not getting pregnant? And I was like, let's not actually talk about that thing right now, So like, I'm not perfect and I'm still working on all of it and boundaries and openness and what's too much and what's not enough. But the key is that we're like in it and we're doing the work because any conversation is better than none.
Yep. Oh, I love it. And I think about life is messy, parenting.
So messy.
Sex is messy. It's like, it's not going to be polished and glossy and, that went just as I planned. It won't. And that's okay. That's life.
None of it. That's right.
Wonderful.
Really good.
Well, thank you so much, Meg, for sharing.
Thank you. This is so fun to chat.
Okay, we'll do it again.
Okay. Thank you. See ya.
Hey, thanks for listening. Please remember to rate and subscribe. I know you might be facing some issues in your life or know someone who is. Issues like anxiety, challenges in dealing with emotions, or other compulsive behaviors like unwanted pornography. And I know it's tough to talk to people about problems. Difficult to stare those obstacles down that we face in life and to really know how to deal with them. It's hard to know what to say and when to say it. And then when that moment you finally reach out to family and friends happens, sometimes it falls flat. I haven't found many programs teaching effective strategies like mindfulness, how to improve relationships, and ways to address unwanted pornography viewing through research-supported principles. So whether you simply want to help with a problem like unwanted pornography, difficulty responding to emotions, or just want to understand the world of someone struggling with porn a little better, head over to LifeAfterPornography.com and get in on the next training. There you'll learn the exact same strategies individuals addicted to pornography used to transform their lives by implementing principles from evidence-based treatment shown effective in research for reducing unwanted pornography viewing. You'll learn the secrets, the myths, the enemies to recovery, and the LAP framework for dealing with unwanted porn viewing that we call WAVE. If that's something that interests you, click the link in the description or just head over to LifeAfterPornography.com. I'm Dr. Cameron Staley. See you on the inside.